is In Depth with Larry Flick on SiriusXM.
All right, so Tom Hiddleston has walked into the room, and it is day one of his New York experience. That is how he described it when he first walked in the room. So now, does that mean that you're just starting rehearsals? Or does that mean you're just starting to talk to people about coming and working here?
It means that I landed in the city yesterday to essentially begin
This adventure.
So, yeah, so I feel very thrilled and excited. Wow. Yeah. Thanks for having me, by the way.
It's my pleasure. I'm Larry Flick, and this is SiriusXM, and you are all in for the greatest treat, because I don't know if people really understand that you're actually more of a classical actor than the mainstream pop cultural consciousness is aware. You played some of my all-time favorite characters.
I played some interesting characters.
That?
I'm played some interesting characters. I'm curious to hear which ones you.
Well, I was thrilled to see. I mean, actually, you didn't play it here, so I couldn't tell you what it was like. But anybody who's brave enough to play Coriolanus is my kind of guy.
Okay.
Because that's a really tough role.
Yeah, it's. I found it enormously challenging, but enjoyable, because this Coriolanus was played at the Donmar Warehouse in London at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. And it's about democracy and the functioning of it. And the Coriolanus as a character is a terrific soldier, but a bad politician. And the reason he's such a great soldier is he's essentially fueled by rage, but that's also what makes him a terrible politician. But the demand on the actor is that you have to inhabit that almost self-annihilating rage, and it's Shakespeare's inquiry into the destructiveness of that anger.
It's such a remarkable, textured, conflicted role, and when I was doing my research and I saw that on the list of characters you played, I thought, damn it, that's good. I would give anything to say, because it's one of my all-time favorite characters in history of theater, because it's so complex.
Very, very complex, about mothers and sons, about...
Well, that's probably the most complicated and the most compelling part of it all, is the relationship with the mother, because she's so the root of his rage.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, you should... play it again sometime so the rest of us could see it.
I think there is we did it. You probably know about the National Theatre Live scheme, where people with the National Theatre have started up a setup where cameras will come in and record theatrical productions and beam them out into movie theatres and cinemas live. So somewhere there may be an encore performance in New York. I know they certainly played it in movie theatres in New York City when we did it, which was January 2014. So somewhere there's a recording of it.
I have officially got a mission.
Okay.
But you're here in New York to do Betrayal,
yes,
the Pinter play.
Harold Pinter.
And it's your Broadway debut.
Very exciting.
I cannot believe, given your theater lineage, that you've never done Broadway before. Well, how has that not happened?
I don't know.
Because it's not like you are a film actor who is dabbling in stage. From my point of view, you were a stage actor who does film. That's my interpretation of you.
Yeah, it's where I started, and it's how I trained. There certainly are, like many British actors, the theatre those are my roots. I went to the Academy of Dramatic Art in London and trained for the theatre, and my film experience has been, all those experiences have been such an extraordinary surprise and delight to me. But and I felt like they came out of the blue, and I had a really good. I've enjoyed those film experiences so much, but certainly the theatre is in my bones, and Broadway has always been a dream of mine. I've played at the theatre in New York once before. I was in a company called Cheek by Jowl, I'm sure you know, who take big classical plays around the world, and we played at BAM in 2007 with Cymbeline at the Harvey for 2.5 weeks, I think. So that was a little taster of what theatre on in New York might be like.
It's very different, though, to be on Broadway because it's the tempo of that part of town. It soaks into every room. As a native New Yorker, I can tell you, I've been in every theater
Wow.
in the city.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to consider this play in New York.
In New York, yes.
Because I've never seen it in New York.
Ah,
and
great.
You've done this on the West End, yeah?
Yes, we had a 13-week run at the Pinter Theatre in London in the first part of this year.
How do you approach taking this play, which is a beautiful piece but a very complicated piece, and make it accessible to mainstream viewers?
Well, I think it is one of his most accessible plays and will endure. I think it has stood and will stand the test of time for that reason, because at the heart of it, it's about relationships and how complex relationships are. For those people who listening who don't know the play, it's about three characters: Robert, Emma, and Jerry. Robert and Emma are married, husband and wife, and Robert and Jerry are old best friends. Jerry was best man at Robert and Emma's wedding. And Jerry and Emma have been having an affair. So it's called Betrayal, very much what it says on the tin. But what's so extraordinary about the way Pinter handles the scenario is that the betrayal is not simply of the husband by the wife. The betrayal is of the friend by the other friend.
Yeah.
Or the lover by the lover, that there are so many layers of betrayal, and that ultimately perhaps each character betrays themselves.
It's the thing that makes it so complex is the language. And in thinking about the array of characters you've played and the writers whose work you've tackled, when did you gain an affinity for language? The only way that someone can continually take on these writers whom you play, whose work you've played, is someone who understands language. That's my point of view, and you can please disagree with me. But having seen your work, seeing your mainstream work, as Loki and in The Night Manager, you bring classical tone even to mainstream work. So that's someone who understands words. So tell me about your connection to language.
That's a really interesting question, and thank you for that. I was actually just having a conversation on the way over here about language. It's something that's always fascinated me since I was at school. I wasn't... it's really curious. When you're a child, you don't know why you're good at things. And I wasn't particularly, in fact, at all gifted at mathematics or the sciences. But as soon as we started learning languages, I found I had an affinity for it. I understood it. Started learning French or taking Latin or Spanish. I just understood how the setup was. And then as the English literature classes at school, when I was a teenager, got more sophisticated, I am fascinated by language as a way. I suppose it is our primary tool of externalizing the many complex feelings and thoughts we have as human beings. And so writers who are precise about language fascinate me. How can we as human beings make ourselves understood when we are so complex and our capacity to feel and think is so profound? And so you have writers like Shakespeare or Pinter who really understand that the only way you can try to connect to another human being is to be precise about language. And that's as much about what you say as about what you don't say. And the key thing with Pinter is what characters actually decide to withhold or exclude. And anyone who's seen or is familiar with Pinter will be aware of the great Pinter pause or the Pinter silence. And those silences are how he holds the characters' thoughts and feelings without language. And then the silence ends because somebody says something and they've chosen deliberately to say it.
Two things come to mind as you say that. One is, do you hear music when you speak?
With Shakespeare, certainly. I think also rhythm. Rhythm is key. mean, I don't feel as I speak to you now that it's particularly musical, but I think with these great playwrights, they're aware of rhythm and music. They're aware.
There's melody, particularly in Pinter.
Yes.
It's a very kind of I don't want to say jazz because that's not it, but there's in the pauses in the air. There's melody. There's knowing when to kind of stop and then hit the chords again.
Yes.
Great writers, to me, write in melody and in rhythm.
Well, there's an amazing example, a couple of examples actually. Shakespeare does the same thing. So obviously Shakespeare writes in iambic pentameter, which has a highly rhythmical pace. Di-dum, 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 di-dum. I do beseech your grace to pardon me, whatever it is. To be or not to be, that is the question. Or that's a feminine ending. You know, if it was going to be a perfect pentameter, then the ION of question wouldn't be there. But sometimes he writes in these pauses. So in Coriolanus, in that great final scene, there's a gap in the line. "Oh, mother, mother, what have you done?" And I think Shakespeare writes a pause in because he understands the character is so shocked. And I think Pinter does the same thing with more regularity. And anyone who's read a Pinter play will understand there are these pauses but also silences. And he said he made a distinction towards the end of his life. Somebody asked him, "Harold, what is it about these pauses? Can you explain?" And he said a pause is when a character is expecting the other person to speak, or has decided not to say the thing they were going to say. A silence is a period of time after which both characters are irreversibly changed. So silence has even more weight. There's something inhabiting the silence, something that cannot be spoken about.
But there's also, in the silence, from my point of view, enormous confidence and assuredness that you're capable, whether it be the writer or the performers, you're capable of holding the attention and the concentration of everyone involved, whether it be the person whose eyes you're looking into or the audience who are looking at the two of you. As an actor, how do you find the courage to let there be space and breathe? Because most people don't speak in pauses because they're just afraid that someone's going to cut them off and that they will never get their words out.
I think it comes back to a question of the stakes. In life, if the stakes are high, if you're having a conversation, two people having a conversation after which a relationship might be over, both characters have to be very careful about what they say. And sometimes the silence is where you understand how much is at stake between these two people. And that could be two friends, or it could be two lovers, or it could be a husband and wife. Those three relationships exist in this play. And I think if you can, as an actor, if you can suffuse the silence with those high stakes, the next thing I say is going to really matter, and you're really listening to me, and I'm either going to save this relationship or we're both going to walk away. And I think most people can really connect to that actually when words really matter, and you have to be really careful about choosing how you say something, people do tend to slow down, and you can feel the silence, and it becomes a charged, energetic silence. It's not dead air. It becomes something very powerfully charged.
So, to me, we're kind of like following links of a chain, right? An affinity for language, the melody, the rhythm, the pauses. They're all kind of connected. How do you carry that connection into your real life? Because even in our conversation right now, this is different than the kind of conversations I usually have in this setting, because I can feel you thinking. And most people never think in a setting like this. They know what they want to talk about, and my job is try to get them to stop that and go somewhere with me.
Right.
And have an honest moment. when did you realize, maybe the question isn't how, but when did you realize that that affinity for language and rhythm and melody and pauses and all those things that make your work as a classical actor come to life, when did you start to feel that kind of infiltrate your real life?
That's such a good question. Wow.
Because it has.
Yes.
I can tell upon introduction, it has. You're one of the more present actors I've talked to in a very long time.
Well, I think it comes back. Maybe it comes back to some of the teaching I was lucky enough to have, or perhaps some of the great acting I have witnessed as a young man, which is, I think, the power and gift of great acting. And I say that as of great actors I have watched: Paul Scofield, Vanessa Redgrave, Michael Sheen, Roger Allam, Simon Russell Beale. Certainly those are actors who had huge influence on me when I was growing up. The gift of it is that it is a representation of something alive, something very real and honest about the experience of being alive. And so the demand on the actor is a demand for presence. You can't be somewhere else. You have to be here, now, in this moment, in this room. And I think that's why the theatre always will endure, because we live in a, for better or for worse, we live in quite a fragmented world, with many demands on our attention. And there's something quite honest about the theatre in that way, that there are all these people sitting in one room, in one space, watching the same thing, and that you can feel when it's present. It has a unique vitality.
How does all of this inform the more contemporary pieces you do, the television, the films? Like I said earlier, I detect classical notes in things like The Night Manager or Loki. Do you approach those men with the same frames of reference, or what happens when you look at a script for a film versus when you're reading Pinter?
Well, I think, when someone like Loki, Stan Lee borrowed those characters from classical myth. They are part of the Norse pantheon.
Well, there is something deeply Shakespearean about those pieces.
And I think he knew that too. I mean, I think even in those early print editions of the Thor comics, he has Thor and Loki speaking in this kind of old, almost Shakespearean dialect. But when you're stepping into the shoes of a character who's been around in the collective consciousness for over 2,000 years, characters like Thor and Loki, you're stepping into something with a sort of gravitas before you've even arrived. So you have to engage with that. If you're going to play the god of something, in this case, the god of mischief, there's a weight to that. But also, I think with The Night Manager, a writer like John le Carré writes in quite a classical way. He sees especially that particular character I played, that he has a kind of classical nobility to him, which is challenged time and time and time again. He's tried to be seduced by the dark side, and there is something classical about that. This war between the good and the bad within him. Those are parts of classical stories, being tempted by the other side. So maybe it's just the way I've read things. Maybe it's my background in it. How I was educated, the things I studied, the books I read, my degree. I don't know.
Have you started to? Actually, let me rephrase that. What is in your little mental catalog of characters you're hoping to play as you get older? Because there are a couple I'd love to see down the line, but I'd love to see you take on more of the American classical writers. I mean, obviously you've done Williams, but like, who are you? I mean, have you done much Ibsen?
I haven't. No, I these are also Ibsen, the great sort of Scandinavian writers. Strindberg, I think, wrote some extraordinary plays. And as you said, the great Americans, Miller. I've always been fascinated by Arthur Miller. I think I've had very profound experiences in the theatre watching other people in those plays. I'm always I feel very careful about. I feel quite lucky to have done what I've done, so I never want to jinx it by writing the wish list too loudly. But I think I would be very grateful if I was able to continue down the Shakespearean sort of path. There are some parts for an older man that I hope I get a crack at one day. I think there's something playing in those big plays, which are so profoundly about the most complex aspects of being alive. They change you as you go through, as I go through my life. I feel because you have to. I have to align myself with his mind, and he had one of the most extraordinary minds that has ever been. And so you inhabit the shapes of his thoughts and the shapes of his writing. It probably sounds pretentious, but some of these big parts like Coriolanus or Hamlet, they slightly change you on a chemical level.
I can't imagine that it couldn't, especially the parts you've played. That's why I'm so fascinated by what could possibly be on your wish list. I mean, I fantasize about seeing you play. To my mind, one of the greatest American writers is Edward Albee. And I would give anything in about, I would say, 20 years, watch you play George in Virginia Woolf.
There's a big boots. Big boots to fill.
You could totally do it. You just have to age a little bit.
Yeah, well, hopefully I'm allowed to do that too.
It's just because there's a dirty quality underneath what you play when it's very smooth that would be fun to see you really embrace.
Well, I'm always fascinated by complex characters. I mean, some of the characters I've played, they're struggling with their own darkness, and they're struggling to contain, not externalizing it and damaging other people. I think Coriolanus absolutely fits into that. Hamlet is, the great tragedy of Hamlet is he cannot contain his grief, and his grief becomes externalized into vengeance, which is ultimately futile.
But when you're playing, I have to let you go in a second, but you just triggered another question that I have to ask you before I say goodbye. When you're playing a piece or a character that has been played countless times, or you do, you know what I mean? There are so many versions of Hamlet, for example.
Of course.
There's so many versions of Streetcar.
Mm-hmm.
I would be paralyzed by the ghosts of the men who played those characters before. So how, when you're approaching something, even with something like Betrayal, which is one of Pinter's well-worn pieces, right? Lots of people have played these parts. How do you calm the ghosts and find your own voice in it?
I think it's about connection, to try to be brave enough to connect deeply with what's being investigated in the writing, and to say, I know that maybe the shapes of these feelings, betrayal, grief, pride, rage, jealousy, whatever the feeling is, to try to connect very personally to it and say, other people may have expressed this differently, but this is how it feels for me. If I had lived this life, this is how it might read in my body. I don't know. I suppose it's just being honest about that, being brave enough to think that my connection with it will be interesting.
Well, I can't wait to see this next performance.
Thank you very much,
Tom Hiddleston. Thank you for joining us. He will be taking over Broadway very soon in this new interpretation of Harold Pinter's Betrayal. We'll keep you abreast of dates and all those things as time goes on.